My name is Jim Pizer, and I'm an academic visitor here at the Kennedy School. And up until this year, I was Secretary of Education here in Massachusetts for 8 years under the Baker administration. And it's my honor to be working along Professor Paul Peterson and Professor Marty West at Harvard here to sponsor this series. And after today's event, we've got just one more, as penultimate might have implied. And it's coming up next Thursday at noon in Taubman, although, correct me if I'm wrong, but not in this space that we're in, back in the old space just around the corner. But that last session will feature Rocco Testani, a partner at Evershed Sutherland in Atlanta, who will be talking about an emerging legal strategy to force legislatures to address educational inequities. And his presentation is entitled "The Right to Education Under State Constitutions, School Adequacy and Equity Litigation." Maybe we can ask you to comment on that.
I would like to come back to that.
I don't know if that's a debate or a dialogue that you can have with them. But nonetheless, hopefully you can all join us for that session as well. Today's session also has a legal angle, in that our featured guest is Clint Bolick, a justice of the Arizona Supreme Court. And as you notice by the weather coming across, you're not in Arizona anymore.
Yes.
And the title of Justice Bolick's talk is "Unshackled: Freeing America's K-12 Education System." Last week we heard from Darrell Bradford of 50 Can, who spoke about an education system without boundaries. So today's discussion will be sort of a variation on that theme, which has been longstanding but is gathering steam in many parts of the country, although perhaps not here in Massachusetts, or not yet. Namely breaking down the monopoly structure of public education and enabling more school options for parents to choose from, unbundling of discrete school services, and unlocking new approaches to schooling and, frankly, to what teaching and learning might even look like in the first place. Prior to joining the court, Clint Bolick was highly visible and successful as a litigator for several public policy and public interest law organizations, most notably as co-founder of the Institute for Justice. And in those roles, Clint has been a staunch advocate for individual liberty, economic empowerment, and educational choice. And earlier in his career, he served in Washington, D.C. with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. After Clint's comments, we will have ample time for questions, answers, and hopefully some discussion. We'll give priority to the folks in the room, but hopefully there are some people online, and if there are some questions that come from virtual space, hopefully folks will enter them into the chat, and we'll try to get to those as well. In addition, this session is being recorded, so for all practical purposes, we're on the record. So I don't know if I should say be careful what you say. But I'm sure, given your august position, you will do so in all cases. But with that, it's my privilege to turn the program over to Clint Bolick.
Thank you so much. It's so great to see you again. Paul Peterson, one of my education mentors, and I think as I was thinking about it today, we were talking about him serving as an expert witness in the very first school voucher program, the Milwaukee program, when it was challenged in court. And I think you were actually my first expert witness ever. So if there were any fumbles, they were totally mine because I didn't know what an expert witness did.
Well, there were fumbles.
So, yes. Nonetheless. It's great to see you all. Thank you for joining us today. I look forward to a very nice discussion. And you may be asking, why is a judge coming to talk to you about education reform? It was the animating reason for my career as a lawyer, which probably sounds a bit odd. I had planned to be a school teacher, in fact, followed that all the way to becoming permanently certified by the state of New Jersey to teach social studies. But it was during my student teaching experience that I first really was able to grasp as a suburban kid the state of our education system in the United States. And around that same time, I took a class in constitutional law, and those two things really came together for me, that I could do more for education in the courtroom than in the classroom, which is a really depressing commentary when you think about it. But I've continued in that passion, litigating Zellman versus Simmons Harris in the U.S. Supreme Court in 2002. But even as a judge now, every criminal case that we get, the defendants had a terrible education. And there is definitely a cause and effect relationship there. So my passion and intensity with regard to education has not dissipated. It has only grown from the bench. There's not much law in my book, Unshackled. And I hold it up because it's my favorite book cover of any of the books that I've published. It's kind of eye-popping. And I don't opine on legal issues that might come before my court, but I am free to pontificate on education policy. And my co-author, Kate Hardiman, who is now an attorney in Washington, D.C., and I do exactly that. I wanted to start off by telling you about two cases I litigated in consecutive years in the United States Supreme Court and the intersection between those two cases. The first was Zellman versus Simmons Harris, in which the U.S. Supreme Court, by the resounding vote of 5-4, upheld the Cleveland School Voucher Program against an attack under the Establishment Clause, and held that it was permissible for a state to provide educational opportunities outside of the public schools that include religious options. And that precedent has allowed states a wide variety of options, including education savings accounts and scholarship tax credits in addition to school vouchers. The next year, I litigated in the U.S. Supreme Court, also to a 5-4 outcome, but with a very different composition among the justices, a case that almost everyone likes, which involved the direct shipment of wine to consumers. And a number of states had made that impermissible, and we argued under the Commerce Clause that the discriminatory trade barriers among the states were unconstitutional, and persuaded a majority of the justices, who I suspect were all wine drinkers, that was a correct position. Now, what do those two cases have in common? Well, to me, everything has a connection with wine, but beyond that, what we were at in the context of wine was a term that those of you who have taken economics or are economists are quite familiar with, and that is disintermediation, eliminating the middleman. Basically, all wine distribution in the states had to flow through liquor wholesalers, who of course were not eager to give up that monopoly position. And the wineries that we represented wanted to transact directly with consumers, and happily for those of us who enjoy wine, this was a toast-worthy decision. So what does that have to do with school? Well, over the last several decades, we have disintermediated almost every aspect of our society. When we go online to Amazon, when we communicate with one another through emails or on Facebook, we've cut out all sorts of middlemen. Not so in education. And in fact, education, K-12 schooling, is one of the few institutions that if you brought someone here from the late 1900s, they would actually recognize. They would recognize almost nothing about our society, but if they went into a public school and saw kids in rows with a teacher in the front, they'd say, wow, this hasn't changed much since the 1900s. And that is just to me, absolutely shocking. That in a society that has advanced so dramatically technologically, that we still have really a 19th century education system in the 21st century. And the results are exactly as you would expect they would be. The United States lags almost all industrialized countries in virtually every subject on tests around the globe. Our system is moribund, special interest controlled, and resistant to change. And that system is worst for the kids who need it the most. Um, this book was written just as COVID was really hitting. And as a result, all of the education statistics that are really, really dismal in the book have changed, and they have gotten worse. Our education system for Black and Hispanic students in this country, by and large, is not improved since Brown versus Board of Education, which proclaimed the core constitutional concept that every American child is entitled to an equal educational opportunity. And I attribute that in large part to the system being so resistant to change. And it's juxtaposed against the technological reality that we now have the capacity to deliver to every child in America a high quality, personalized education at a fraction of the cost that it costs us to not accomplish that goal. So the question that Kate Hardiman and I sought to answer in this book was, how do you transform a 19th century education system into a 21st century education system? And we began with a thought experiment. If you were designing a K-12 education system in the year 2023 or 2021, when this book was published, with no preconceptions of what it should look like, you were building it from scratch, what would it look like? And I think if ever you're in a traffic jam or something, let your thoughts turn to that question. The only thing I can guarantee you will come up with is that it would look almost nothing like the system that we have today, a command and control, top-down, largely monopolistic system organized around school district lines, many of which were drawn centuries ago, with wide disparities in education funding, wide disparities in quality, and so on and so forth. So, so we sketched out our vision of what it would look like, and it may differ from what you all would come up with, but I think that we have to think expansively if we are really going to solve this problem. We've been really working on tangential change for a really long time, and I think that one of the reasons that we haven't gotten so far is precisely because we've been thinking so small. If we think structurally, it may be possible to have groups of people who have been at odds with each other come together, because that there is something in it for all of them. And you'll see exactly what we mean by that. Kate and I started the book off with 10 principles that we hope that most people agree with, or that most people agree with most of them. And I'll actually turn to the book to just tell you what those 10 principles are. The first one is perhaps the most controversial and a huge obstacle to change. And that is that the school system is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. If you ask most people that, they would agree with you. And yet, anytime anyone suggests systemic change, the response is, wait a minute, that will hurt the system. They almost never say it will hurt the children. They will always say it will hurt the system. It will take money away from the system. And the system, we have to understand, is not the end to itself. If delivering high quality education to every child meant completely eradicating and replacing the system, we should support that. I don't think that it means that. I hasten to add, since we're on the record. But if it did mean that, if we're serious about Brown versus Board of Education and the guarantee of education, which by the way exists in almost every state constitution as well, then we should be prepared to do what it takes. Public education should be concerned about whether, not where, kids are learning. The third education policy should be about kids, not adults. We saw during COVID that in too many schools, it was about the adults. And the kids became secondary considerations. Fourth, we should recognize that every child is different. Homogenized education is likely to not be stellar education because it takes every child down the middle rather than working to the skills or the lack thereof of individual children. This one also incredibly controversial. Schools should operate like businesses, as if they actually have a product to offer, and they need to attract people to buy that product, and they need to be held accountable if the product does not succeed. Power over education should be allocated to those who have the greatest stake in the children's success. That means parents, teachers, and principals. Funds should be allocated towards students, not schools. That fulfills the accountability and the attraction of a high quality product. Variety should be the spice of education. One size fits all simply doesn't work. And we should not fear those who have a different approach toward education. I happened, before I was on the court, to have served on the corporate boards of both the Great Hearts Charter Schools and the Basis Charter Schools. Many of you are probably familiar with one or both. Incredibly different schools with incredibly different educational philosophies, and what they shared are incredible outcomes. So different kids learn differently, and we should not be afraid of variety. Reforms should be adopted, and this is, education providers should be responsible for outcomes. This has got to be the only area in which, in American life, where if the product fails, the answer is to give it more money. Imagine a car company operating that way. Oh my gosh, we'd be driving around in lemon. And finally, reforms should be adopted with an urgency that reflects the reality. Kids have 12 years of studying. A reform that may help in 10 years means losing a generation of kids. So those are the principles that we operated by and that informed our specific proposals. The one reform that most people automatically and reflexively move to is we do need to spend more money. And we reject that for a variety of reasons. The most common solution is not, in this case, the best. We have experienced over the last 50 years in our country a massive spending increase in public school education in terms of real dollar comparisons. We also spend $1,000 more than the OECD average. The OECD is the collection of industrialized countries, essentially our economic competitors. A recent OECD study found that the amount of money spent has zero correlation with the educational outcomes. Much more important than how much is spent is where it is spent and how it is spent. Our primary suggestion is one that is startling to people when they first hear it, and that is we need to abolish school districts. The school districts, in our view, are the principal obstacle to meaningful education reform. They are the source of funding inequality because of property taxation funding so many schools. They are, and so for that reason, there are engines of inequality. I'm echoing. The district lines are obsolete. I mean, no one would draw district lines the way they are now, and yet they are often immutable because there's such strong political clout behind keeping them the way they are. They are susceptible to special interest dominance. They add very little to the educational enterprise, but they absorb a massive percentage of the educational funding. I'm not going to spend much time on education statistics except in this area. So what they amount to, and this is very unusual in the world, is double control over schools, local district control plus state control, and triple bureaucracy. Because the schools have a bureaucracy, the districts have bureaucracy, and the state has bureaucracy. As a result of that, out of every education dollar we spend in this country, we spend 55 cents on teachers. The OECD average is 64 cents, nearly a 20% difference. Most OECD countries spend 15 cents on administration out of every education dollar. We spend a quarter of our education dollar on bureaucracy. As a result of that, our schools are more bureaucratic and less autonomous than Russian schools. And Russia prides itself on its bureaucracy, right? And in this area, education, probably alone, we out-bureaucratize the Russians. Between 1950 and 2015, the number of American students in K-12 education doubled. So between 50 and 2015, the number of students doubled. The number of teachers increased by 243%. So not too much of a difference, but the student-teacher ratio went down. The number of administrators increased by 709%. So how does that translate? Well, in 1950, the student-teacher ratio was 27.5 to 1, and the administrator-student ratio was 65 to 1. So one administrator for every student. Today, the number is 16 to 1 for both. There are an equal number of administrators and teachers in our system now. Has the system improved? Absolutely not. Between 1992 and 2015, if the costs of administration had simply kept pace with the increase in the number of students, so it would increase the same as the number of students, we would have saved $805 billion, or enough to give every teacher in America an $11,000 salary increase. So our view is that the middleman ought to be cut out of the picture. So what do you do then with the services that districts do provide? Well, you do what charter schools do, and that is you set up you set up institutions or contract with institutions that provide economies of scale in such areas as special education, transportation, health insurance, and so forth. So instead of districts that are essentially political mechanisms, you have service providers that deliver economies of scale. Along with this, you decentralize control from the districts to the individual schools. Each individual school operates as a unit to itself. The state sets and enforces minimum standards. I know Massachusetts has done very well with its state standards, or Paul can correct me if I'm wrong about that. Um, and provides all of the base funding for schools. But the schools decide their funding priorities, and they hire and fire according to their own needs and interests. Guess what? Most schools are not going to allocate that money to bureaucracy. If you go into a private school, or sorry, a private school, but also a charter school, you walk into the front office, there's not very many people there. And some of them get behind the wheel of a bus at the end of the day and provide economies of scale. We should hire and compensate well great teachers. We should recruit from a much larger pool. Looking at basis schools, they get their math and science professors, Freudian slip there, teachers from Intel. These are people who really, really know what they're talking about. And they pay them commensurately. They pay their math and science teachers more than their other teachers. Why? Because they're in scarce supply and they're sought after. We should have performance-based pay. And we talk about class sizes being too big, and we're always trying to reduce the class size. If you've got a great teacher like Jaime Escalante, that teacher should be teaching more students, not less, and compensated for teaching more students rather than less. And we've got to give schools more autonomy over firing poor performing teachers. Competition and choice, I think for me goes without saying, but the reason that we wrote this book is that I believe that most on the conservative side of the scale of the political spectrum have focused on competition and choice to the exclusion of talking about what should happen in the public schools, where even in a state like Arizona, the vast majority of students are still learning in the public schools. But nonetheless, and hence our effort to contribute to that conversation. That, especially after COVID, the idea of micro schools and hybrid learning, where children are learning part of the day on computers that are delivering education to move each child along in each subject according to the child's accomplishments, and alerting the teacher to where there are deficiencies. All of these things should be possible within the school district. I said district when I just said we should be abolished in the school system. This includes promoting the use of technology. If there's one model of a state that we think has done the best with regard to education reform, it's Florida. Florida, before Jeb Bush, had a school system that ranked among the poorest in the country. And Florida adopted a lot of the recommendations that we are now talking about. For example, giving teachers bonuses for their kids passing the AP exams. Guess what? The number of Black and Hispanic kids taking and passing the AP tests soared. And in fact, Florida is the one state in which the racial academic gap was all but eliminated. And that is so head spinning that I think we ought to be looking at what they did. They reformulated failing schools. They gave every school a grade, and if they failed in multiple years, they created a new leadership structure. Obviously, charter schools, education savings accounts, pretty impressive results. Ultimately, at the end of the day, one of the things that we've seen is that teacher unions and school districts have pretty much been hand in hand in resisting education reform. That, in my mind, is not necessarily a natural alliance. And if teachers are given an incentive to make triple figure salaries, if they are really successful, and to have less of a bureaucracy to deal with, and to actually be part of the governance team in their schools, I think you might see a realignment where parents and teachers' interests begin to align more closely, and we are able to see reform flourish. The bottom line is, it seems to me that our problem is so bad, and our most important competitors, especially China, doing so well in K-12 education in terms of educational outcome. It is not just a matter of educational equity, a matter of educational opportunity. It is a matter of national security that we improve our K-12 education system, or our clocks will be cleaned by countries that we do not want to see supplant the United States in world leadership. And so the bottom line for me is, in talking about these ideas and trying to start this conversation, there is no idea that is too radical. There are only ideas that are not radical enough. And with that, I look forward to your comments, questions, and whatever happens next. Thank you.
Sounds pretty exciting.
Yeah, really, exactly.
So why don't I kick it off and ask
Please
you
do.
a question, but obviously folks in the room, please be thinking about what you might want to say or ask. So, I mean, as you said at the outset, one of the interesting things is that if you took your 10 principles sort of outside the context of the preconceived notions of where they're coming from, or what the agenda might be, you would find parents, educators, people say, yes, of course, that's what we're trying to do. So,
I hope that's true.
well, I think, I mean, I've believe me, I think it is. Although, interestingly enough, it may be more actually from the traditionally progressive, sounds like the wrong word, but from the progressive side of the education world, rather than the more traditionalist side, where you would find that these 10 principles resonate most. But nonetheless, I think there would be a lot of agreement and support and even enthusiasm. And yet, here we are. So I wonder, and there obviously are, technical and practical, issues around how you move from point A to point B. It's not necessarily simple or straightforward, but the politics of it seem to be the biggest obstacle. And yet, we're seeing in various places around the country this movement, which may be the right way of describing it, around ESAs, which is sort of injected new life, if that's the right word, or new energy behind what was previously sort of thought of as the voucher movement. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what your sense is for why that's happening, whether that's going to continue, and what the sort of future trajectory of that might look like.
That's a really great question. And as someone who came into the issue of school choice, I mean, we could not have achieved anything without cross-ideological alliances. And now, unfortunately, the issue of education reform in many instances is viewed as a partisan issue, which is really unfortunate because all of us have a stake in solving these problems. So in a certain sense, things have gotten worse. And oftentimes things have to get worse before they get better. So I'm hoping that that's where we are right now. And you're right, we are seeing. So when I was talking about ideas being too radical or not radical enough, ESAs are actually a really good example of that. Arguing for school vouchers was incredibly tough, in part because the backs of the teachers' unions and their members would really get up. And it's like you're trying to destroy the public schools, you're trying to drain money from the public schools and have you're trying to privatize public education. The idea of education savings accounts, which is a much more radical idea than vouchers, instead of simply saying, we're going to pay for you to go here instead of going here. It's a fundamentally different concept, and that is delivering education resources to families who can use it for any purpose. They don't have to go to private schools. And in fact, many of them don't. You can have home education. You can have cafeteria style education where you, in some instances, can purchase services from public schools like chemistry labs or sports programs and that sort of thing. Tutoring, micro schools now have really evolved from education savings accounts, and it's an easier sell, even though it is a more radical idea, because people can see why it would benefit them. Even if they don't want to send their kids to a private school, which most parents don't want to do. So I think, too, the idea of decentralizing the system, when you talk to public school teachers and ask them, what would you do if you were in charge of allocating the funding, their eyes light up and they all have ideas about how that money should be spent. Well, guess what? You offer a proposal that delivers that power to them. They may be open to it, even if it means the opportunity for more families to leave that school. It's a trade-off that may very well be acceptable. Having said that, the main driver, and I think everyone in this room would probably agree with this, of the sudden openness to education reform was COVID. And we saw a system, and we wrote that principle before we saw this in action. We saw a system that was prioritizing adults over children, and the children really suffered. And parents who would not have been open to any of these ideas in the past are suddenly saying, my kids are my priority. And if I'm going to help start a micro school or something like that, we're open to that idea. It's very similar to what happened in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina. Wipes out the city, and then suddenly they start a school system from scratch without preconceptions, and it turns out to be a dramatic improvement over what they had before. So we actually refer in the book, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, we refer to COVID as the Katrina moment for American public education, because the resistance to reform has diminished. Are there still institutional, very strong units of institutional resistance to reform? Absolutely, there are. But I think that if you offer reform that does empower all of the most important people in delivering high quality education, that those units of resistance may dissipate. But again, it can't be a partisan issue. And one of the things that we're seeing with ESAs, I mentioned this in our last class, are the people benefiting from it that are not politically aligned in favor of it but also what makes possible. In Arizona, after ESAs were created, I read in a news article that a school for children, for transgender children and children with gender dysphoria was created. It was not possible to create that school until ESAs. Those who support that school are probably not conservatives, probably not people who vote for Republican school choice advocates. But it is empowering them to start a school that they believe is in the best interest of their children, and that is a means of realignment.
Great. Any questions?
Thought there might be something. If you don't mind introducing yourself
Yeah, I'll
and
do that.
where you are, I'd really
Yeah,
love
yeah,
to know who you are.
I'm Pradeep. I am a visiting fellow at South Asia Institute. I work on educational inequalities in the Indian context. I am a professor at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. So I am here for some time to do my research on educational inequalities in India. I am fascinated to listen several reforms that is happening in US and what need to be done from you. Very interesting. I have 2 points to raise. My first point is about your concern on the middleman in education. While it is being not vanished, it has reduced at least in other areas, but it's not being there in the context. My idea, I want to understand more about why it is the case. What happened to why education is, do you think education is a very different sector that it is not happening? That is number one. I need more comments from you. My second point is about about situating education in the political agenda. What happens across the globe if you find sectors where politicians are interested, education may be at the bottom. I'm saying in my country's context, and I see in developing countries as well. I'm not so far clear in US context where they put education in their reform agenda, political reform agenda. But if you see in India, in that case, they are more concerned about building roads, they are more concerned about distributing rice and other facilities. But when you come to the spending on education, reforming education, because it is at the bottom, this is because this is not connected to their vote bank politics. Because you will not be rewarded. A politician will not be rewarded by bringing changes in the education sector. That's the reason they keep doing it at the bottom. They always keep in the lower. So what do you think in that? If that is the case, then how things are working?
So those are two really good questions, and I can only imagine the difficulty of in India of addressing these problems where the lines between classes are so much stronger than they are here in the United States. I think, the resistance in terms of political parties, obviously, Democrats have been far more aligned with teacher unions in the United States. But it's always been tricky because the strongest grassroots supporters of school choice, in particular in the United States, have been low-income Black and Hispanic uh, uh, individuals, and their representatives are the least likely to support school choice. The flip side has traditionally been when I started out in this area in 1990, many Republicans were opposed to school choice because they didn't want low-income kids coming to their schools. The reason that there was so much segregation in part was schools and preserving neighborhoods, preserving school districts, and so forth. So it was a really tough political equation at that time. And the breakthroughs came in Wisconsin and Ohio when liberal Democrats supporting minority districts and conservative Republicans came together in a very odd couple alliance that has almost never been replicated to make that happen. Increasingly, Republicans have become more open to school choice especially when they're recognizing that inner city kids don't go out to the suburbs for their education. They want good schools in their own neighborhoods. And so the fear factor has dissipated. But Democrats increasingly have been less willing to cross that line than they were in Wisconsin and Ohio. And that makes it more difficult. But this recent phenomenon of parents, and of course we saw this in the Virginia gubernatorial election 2 years ago. Typically, parents had not prioritized, and this kind of gets to the second part of your question, had not really prioritized education reform, and now are. It's like a sleeping giant that has been awakened. And especially suburban parents who thought their schools were great, even if they weren't, are recognizing that they increasingly need options, and that the system needs to be more parent-centered than system structured. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen with that and whether that will catalyze. But I'll tell you, if there could be an alliance between parental interests and teacher interests, then that would be a game changer.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Craig Makoff. I'm a senior fellow at the Mossad Rahmani Center for Business and Government.
Cool.
I'm not an education person, but I've studied the fiscal situation of a lot of states in a lot of detail in some troubled school districts. I think your ideas are fascinating. Let's just say let's do it. Let's do it in a state, and let's say it works, then other states will follow. We have an example. It's not an ideological debate. It's more efficient.
Right.
If you were to take that approach, which state would you start with?
Wow, man, there's a question I've never done. Of course, I'll volunteer Arizona because of my interest. So if I take off the political realities, it would probably be
Alaska.
It would probably be New York, Illinois, or New York. And the reason is that none of these reforms exist in any of those states. And so I think it would have the capacity for the greatest transformative effect. So I would probably, and of those, even though Chicago obviously is, would be a great incubation center like New Orleans was, they at least have some rudimentary forms of school choice, whereas California and New York really don't. So those would be my volunteers, setting aside the fact that they probably, even though they need it the most, they are the least likely to adopt.
Just a quick follow-up. So state constitutional Blaine amendments are often a barrier to this. Do ASAs present a loophole or workaround, or is there some way to address those legal constitutional questions?
So this happened to have come up precisely in the Professor Peterson's class that I just taught. So education savings accounts were born in Arizona out of a court loss, where vouchers were struck down under the Blaine Amendment. And by the way, just so that you know, Blaine amendments are provisions that exist in either 37 or 38, depending on how you count them, including Massachusetts, that say that essentially that no public funds shall be spent to aid or benefit sectarian education. That was meant as Catholic when these provisions were added to constitutions in the late 19th century. and they were anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. But now the term sectarian has acquired a synonym meaning for religion. So they were a serious obstacle in a number of states, including Arizona, where vouchers were struck down by my court before I joined it. And education savings accounts, because the money could be used for a wide variety of purposes and not just tuition in private schools, were upheld under the Blaine Amendment subsequently. So they were born of necessity rather than inspiration. But I actually think they're a more systemic form of education reform than vouchers. But Blaine amendments are no longer the problem that they used to be. And that is because of a recent, 1 year ago, US Supreme Court case called Carson versus Macon, in which the Blaine Amendment was used in Maine to argue that their tuitioning system, Maine and Vermont did not build public schools in a number of rural communities. And so the state would simply give you tuition money that you could use in an adjacent school district, a private non-sectarian school, or even a school outside of the state. So it was really a choice program, except that religious schools were not permitted. And the argument was religious schools have to be excluded by virtue of these Blaine amendments and related state policies. And the US Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that is impermissible discrimination against religious schools, that the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause in tandem forbid discrimination against religious schools or in favor of religious schools. And as a result, the Blaine amendments that are often used to prevent this sort of change have essentially been defanged, for lack of a better term, to a large extent as a barrier. That's not to say that there are not other state constitutional provisions that could be used, and they vary 50 ways. Every state has a different constitution that could be used to prevent some or all of these reform proposals. But the Blaine Amendment was the main one, and that one is largely no longer a major factor.
Thank you very much for such an insightful talk.
I'm
a mid-career student here at HKS. I'm from Brazil.
Cool.
I
I visited a state Supreme Court in Brazil not too
Interesting.
long
What
ago.
state?
Boa Vista.
In Roraima.
Yes,
That's-
Roraima.
that's-
Yes.
That's interesting. I want to know more about that. Roraima is like the most remote.
Yes, it
Brazil.
is.
On the border
Yes,
with
it is.
Venezuela.
It was not
I
easy
was
to
there.
get
I was there 5 months ago. Interesting city.
I loved it.
But I have been interested in education policy for a while, and I've deepened my interest when I had the opportunity to serve as a member of state parliament for the last 4 years. Now I'm currently a deputy member of the federal parliament, which gives me some space to be here for a year.
Oh, so cool.
And I've always found it interesting, and what he said, it's completely true in terms of practical politics, because politicians, especially managers on the executive branch, they see very clearly that education, the improvements in the quality of education, is something that is not seen as bringing votes. So they're rather focused on the resources on other areas. But my question is, Brazil is like 15 years late in the discussion of charter schools, at least. Not to speak about the cultural differences, the differences between the level of centralization we have there. But since the beginning of the experiences with charter schools here, if I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of the 90s, right?
Did they go back to the 80s or?
91.
What were the most effective tactics on engaging the faction that seems to be to be crucial to promoting change in educational policy, which is not obviously the trade unions of teachers who will naturally be against, but parents who are by default apparently apathetic about changes that will impact their children's lives. But yeah, it's their destiny, their lives that are at stake, and it's so hard to mobilize them, especially in Brazil, because differently from here in Brazil, if you can't afford to send your children to a private school, you will send. So public schools are usually poor families, poor middle income families, because it usually translates into not caring that much about their education, which is really sad because it perpetuates this terrible situation of lack of access to good human capital. But my main point, therefore, is how what were the most effective tactics on engaging parents and public opinion on this matter?
So, and Jim and Paul Peterson may have different perspectives on this. Charter schools started out as a liberal idea. Actually, vouchers did too, with John Coons and Steve Sugarman at Berkeley. So it was a much easier sell initially. And they are still a public school. In Arizona, charter schools were used as a way to forestall vouchers. Vouchers came within one vote of being adopted in Arizona, and suddenly people who were resistant to charter schools said, "Oh, we'll do charters instead of school vouchers." So there's all sorts of political dynamics. They in recent years have become more associated with conservatives and Republicans than previously. But previously, there was a pretty broad political coalition behind charter schools. Now, you find if you were to look at the parent composition of charter schools, my guess would be that there'd be more Democrats than Republicans. You have, of course, a large low-income population in a lot of charter schools. And you also have parents who say, wow, my kid can get a world-class education and I can save $25,000 a year off of private school. And that appeals to liberal and conservative parents. And I think that has made charter schools much more resistant to attack than other forms of school choice. So in our country, low-income parents have always supported change, but it has been very difficult for them to effectuate it. What I think happened during COVID is that one of the reasons there was such a resistance to public school reform or to private choices is because so many parents were so satisfied with public schools that they thought were really, really good. And then during COVID, they discovered that they weren't, that they didn't put their kids first. And as a result, the political, I've even seen some polls where Republicans are rated higher on, Republican candidates are rated higher on the likelihood that they'll improve education over Democrats. And that's never been the case before. And I attribute it entirely to COVID and the response. So that's a long way of saying that there was an unusual political dynamic that produced charter schools. Now that there are so many charter schools that so many politically powerful people are a part of, I think it's difficult to dislodge that. What does that mean for other countries? I have no idea.
Hey, Michael, are there any questions coming through online? Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Eliza. I'm a master's student at the Graduate School of Education.
Hi, Eliza.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thanks.
I'm a former teacher, just got out of the classroom, so in grad school.
DFA or?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but then I taught for 10 years, so not just,
Awesome.
yeah. And I love the idea of getting rid of districts. I went to school in Maryland where the districts are the county, so just a lot more equality because they're not like these tiny one high school districts. How do you see getting rid of districts? Is that, and I was teaching in California where we have these like itty bitty districts of like only white people, so that like people don't have to go to school with Black and brown students in Oakland. So how do you see getting rid of, is that a feasible?
Yeah, so that's really a great question. And by the way, I think one of the drivers of systemic education reform has been TFA because incredibly bright and well-educated young people are going into the schools and seeing them. I mean, that was my epiphany as well. And seeing what they're like and that we really need to change things. And so I typically find, and I find a lot of TFA alumni in law schools too. They're doing exactly what I had set out to do. So I should have mentioned that as a potential political dynamic, and also often cross-ideological alliances there as well. But so Maryland probably would, would be a state where this is less likely to happen, in part because of the county lines. Arizona, by contrast, and you mentioned California as well, we have not only school districts, but school districts that do not align with geographic boundaries, and elementary school districts that don't align with the secondary school district line. So you may find yourself as a kid in one district. I mean, it just makes no sense whatsoever. And the inequalities, between the districts are amazing. And we do have public school choice, open enrollment in Arizona that has alleviated some of the problems that flow from that. I think that the main obstacle to getting rid of school districts is that people aren't talking about it. It is one of those things that when I talk to ordinary people or even political activists about, their eyes widen because they've never thought about that before. I actually think that it may be one of those issues that liberals and conservatives might find common cause on. And so that was really one of the motivations for writing the book, was as a conversation starter. I am hearing that the JFK School is exploring this idea, and I hope that more people talk about it. But I actually think that even though there would be enormous resistance, a state like Texas, where the districts are the largest employers in their communities, not going to happen anytime soon. But I actually think that it would release, and I should hasten to add, the money solves the problems issue is exacerbated by the fact that when you do increase funding, even if it's earmarked for teachers' salaries, it doesn't get there. They hire additional administrators, or they give pay raises to the administrators. And so the more people who talk about this, the more well, I'm not going to say this next part, but let's just say that
Well, wait till the camera gets turned off.
there's an active audience for these ideas.
So I think we're just at about time, unfortunately. Any sort of closing remarks or thoughts you might have before we
Well,
close?
I just am I'm excited to hear the questions that were asked here. Professor Peterson's class was inspiring to me in terms of the level of knowledge, but one of the things, that I can say is in the education arena, how many times I've seen one parent or one activist ignite an entire movement in whether it's in a local school district or on a broader scale, like Holly Williams, the legislator who got things started in Wisconsin. And don't underestimate your own capacity to ignite those kinds of reforms. It may be peculiar to education, probably not, but seeing what's happening in school districts around the country right now, it's exciting. So go get them.
Thank you very much. See you all next week. Mandatory attendance.